Hi, Trish Triumpho Sullivan here, and we're going to talk today about basic daylight exposure, or BDE, and the sunny 16 rule. Right, got a little sunshine there. Hey, maybe it needs to be more orange so it looks more sunny, right? Let's see here. So we've got sunny 16 rule, and this is really important for these classes because we're using film cameras, right? We have an opportunity to use film cameras. This is my old Nikon film camera, and it's a really great camera. I love this camera. I use it quite a bit still, and I have other cameras I use as well, but this is a go-to camera for me, and it's a good old single lens reflex 35 millimeter camera, film camera. Okay, and I want to go over this with you guys because when you're using a film camera, the settings are so much more important. And it's so much more important that you plan your exposures. So in other words, you want to look at the light conditions. You want to make sure that your exposure is correct. And you probably want to bracket. You want to bracket your shots, usually 3 to 5 shots in a bracket. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But let's start off with the sunny 16 rule, okay? So this is the rule that I want you guys to memorize, okay? Before you can memorize it, you might make a little cheat sheet, like take a Post-it note or a small piece of paper, an index card that you can keep with your camera, and write this down, right? It's not big. It's not a big deal. It's not a BFD. It's a BDE, right? Okay. So, basic daylight exposure, sunny 16 rule. So what do you think sunny 16 rule means? Well, first of all, sunny, right? This is a big clue. Sunny. So there has to be sun. 16 stands for f16, which is your starting aperture. So full sun, right? f16. And then let's get into the rest of it. Okay, so I'm going to erase this so we have some room to write. Okay, so the sunny 16 rule is basic daylight exposure. That's what it is. But it's really, for me, it's a lot easier to remember the sunny 16 because of the name. You need sun, and you're going to start at f16. So the sunny 16 rule, you want full sun. A full sunny day, right? It's not a cloudy day, it's a sunny day where the sun is hitting hitting the ground, and where you cast a shadow, right? That's full sun. So you want full sun, and the sun has to be 20 degrees above the horizon. It doesn't matter if it's the sun coming up in the morning or going down at night. The fact is that 20 degrees is going to be kind of, so if this is the horizon, 20 degrees is going to be about like that. So it has to be high enough to be shining light on you, right? If it's really low, it's going to be obstructed by buildings and trees and whatever stuff in the way. And so it has to be just high enough so that you can actually get light on you, right? So 20 degrees above the horizon. And that just means that you can see the sun, okay? That's it. But I put that on there because that's what it is. So you want to start out with full sun. And then your settings on your camera, you want your aperture at f16. This is the starting. This is your benchmark. So you're always going to have your aperture start at f16. And your shutter speed is 1 over the ISO. Okay, so what does that mean? That means if your ISO is at 200, the closest shutter speed, right, this is ISO is 200, would be 1/250th of a second. So if you're using 200 ISO film, right, you would start with your shutter speed at 1/250th of a second, because that's the closest to 200 speed film. If you're using an ISO of 400 speed, what's the closest shutter speed to that? If you guessed 1/500th of a second, you would be correct. Okay, because that's going to be the closest full shutter speed to that ISO, right? And if you, and my dogs are deciding that they're going to help us with the lesson today by barking about how beautiful and sunny it is outside and letting everyone know that it's time to go out and take photographs, okay? So they're really excited about the sun and being outside, and you should be too, right? So, so if your ISO is at 400, you'd have 1/500th of a second. Let's say you have your ISO set at 800 or 1600. What's your closest shutter speed, right? Well, if your shutter speed set at 800, it would be 1/1000, right? If your shutter speed is, if your ISO is at 1600, I think some people might even have a shutter speed like that, but you may not. You may just, your closest shutter speed may be 1/2000th of a second. Okay, so that is how you figure out your shutter speed. So whatever your ISO is set at, you're going to get the closest shutter speed. So let's just for this demonstration, we'll just say that you're using an ISO of 200. So we'll start off with a shutter speed of 1/250, right? 1/250th of a second, right? It's a fraction. Just like your aperture is a fraction, right? Okay, so now that we have our beginning settings, and remember this is if we had an ISO of 200, right? That would be our starting setting. So we'd be starting off 1 over the ISO, which in this case would be about 250, right? So for the Sunny 16 rule, this would be your starting settings if you're out in full sun, right? Then you can change them if you have different effects you want. Let's say you want a slow shutter speed because you want to show some motion blur, or you want a fast shutter speed because you want to freeze motion, right? So in that case, let's write up some, let's see, we'll go F2, F4. I'm just going to round these pretty quick. F11, whoops. Go F5.6, F8, F11, F16, F22, and F32. Okay, so those are your apertures. And for your shutter speeds, right, we've got 1/15, 1/30th of a second, 1/60th, 1/125th, 1/250th, 1/500th, 1/1000th, 1/2000th, right, etc. Right? It could go up to 1/3000th, or even much higher, right? Much faster shutter speed. So in this case, we're starting off, right, at F16, which why it's Sunny 16 rule. Remember, we got the sun, Sunny 16, okay, and 2/50th of a second. Use a different color on that so we can see it. There we go. Let me use So we've got f16 at 2/50th of a second. Let's say that you want to freeze motion. So now you're going to change your shutter speed let's say 1/2000th of a second. So 3 up. All you've got to do to keep the correct exposure, and this is where we're talking about exposure equivalency, right? So this is going to be the equivalent exposure. So if I speed up my shutter 3 stops, right, I'm going to have to open my aperture 3 stops to compensate, right? That's what exposure equivalency is. So I'm starting off with the correct exposure, but the equivalent exposure can be had just by balancing out. That's that reciprocity that we talk about in beginning photo, right? That the aperture and the shutter have a reciprocal relationship. So if you change one, you've got to change the other in order to keep that same exposure, right? So, and you can change your, the Sunny 16 rule doesn't just work when you're out in the full sun. It can work on a foggy day, like clouds and fog, because guess what? Where do we live out here? We live in Salinas Valley, where we get marine layer and fog on a regular basis. So if you have clouds and fog, you just have to add 3 stops more light, right? So you're adding 3 stops more light to this basic f16 and the shutter speeds to start the starting shutter speed. Okay, if you're indoors, right, you just have to add 4 to 5 stops more light. Okay, if you are at a nighttime, but a bright nighttime, let's say like a well-lit street or a night game. I'm just going to put night game here so you understand that there is light, there's bright light going on. You can just add 6 stops more light, right, to get that same correct exposure. If you're doing candlelight, and believe me, there's times when you're going to want to do this. You're going to want to know what exposure do you need to get a correct exposure. You're going to need 10.5 more stops of light, right, to do that candlelight exposure. So the Sunny 16 rule, you guys, works no matter where you're at in the world, right? Because the sun is the same brightness all over the world. And as long as it's sunny out and the sun is 20 degrees above the horizon, okay? So full sun, 20 degrees. You have your aperture at sunny 16, right? F16. And your shutter speed is 1 over the ISO. So whatever the closest shutter speed to your ISO is, if you're using 200, it would be 250. If you're using 400 ISO, like ISO film, and your ISO is set at 400, then you would use, your shutter speed would be at 1/500th of a second. So the closest shutter speed to your ISO setting for your film. Remember, you're using a film camera, right? So whatever your ISO on your film is, you have to set the ISO on your camera so it's going to expose properly, okay? So that said, if you are adding more light, right, or whatever you're wanting to do, okay, so let's say you wanted to freeze motion, right? We showed you how to do that. What if you wanted to blur motion, right? Well, you're starting off at f16 and 1/250th, because right now we're at ISO 200, right? We're just gonna say that, okay? Because you may have a different ISO and have a different speed there. But let's say you wanna show some motion blur, so you're gonna slow your shutter speed down, 1, 2, 3 stops. So what are you gonna do for your aperture so you can balance that out? Well, you're gonna close your aperture down 2 stops, and if you don't have that 3rd stop, you might actually push your film excuse me, by changing your ISO a little bit so you can get that extra stop, because the ISO can actually count as an extra stop when you're using film. It's called pushing your film, and in that case you would change your ISO, say to 400 to get that extra stop. Okay, so that's how you can do that if you're trying to change, because you're wanting to freeze motion and here you are, right? You don't have that extra stop. All right, so now clouds and fog, you need 3 stops more light. So you either slow down your shutter speed, right, if things aren't moving, or you can open up your aperture, right? Make your aperture larger. Remember, the smaller number is the largest aperture. The larger the aperture. Okay, and each of these whole numbers, you guys, either exactly doubles the light, right? If you're letting in more light, that every whole number next to it either doubles the light or halves the light, right? Either it makes it 2 times or half the light coming in. So if you're adding more stops because you want to let in more light, so you have a cloudy day, you add 3 more stops, right? Indoors, you add 4 more. So maybe you do a combination. Maybe you have 3 stops here and the 4th one goes there, right? 6 stops. You might have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Okay, and then this would be 6. Does that make sense? Yeah. The same with the candlelight, 10.5 stops. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This might be too slow, right? 1/30 of the second's pretty slow. So here's where you might really need to make sure you change your ISO as well, and you might want to have your ISO go to 800 in order to do this, okay? To get that 10.5 stops more light, right? Does that make sense to you? Okay, good. Because this is the most important thing that you need to know for taking good photos. The second most important thing you need to know, besides this, using the Sunny 16 rule, is bracketing. And by bracketing, that means that you take photos at 3 to 5 different exposures while you're doing this. And if you have a digital camera, your camera, you can set it to automatically bracket. But a bracket is really great. And if you've ever done any math, you've probably seen these brackets where they keep a collection of numbers, right? So if I were going to bracket my shot, and I'm using the Sunny 16 rule, remember I'm starting at f16, well, I could do a couple different things. I could take a photo at the correct exposure, right, f16, and then I could take one at f11 and one at f22. Or I could just change my shutter speed and do the same kind of a thing by bracketing my shutter speed. See, this is going to change my depth of field just a little bit. And maybe I don't want that. Maybe I just want to have my shutter speed change. So I'm starting off, say, at 1/250th of a second. Right? And then I'd also do one photo at 1/125th and one at 1/500th. Right? And that would be my bracket. That would give me 3 different exposures. This one is the correct exposure, but just to make sure that I get a photo that I like, I'm going to take one that's a little bit overexposed and one that's a little bit underexposed, to make sure that I have insurance, right? Bracketing is basically insurance that you get the right shot. And, and the other thing is make sure your focus is right. Right? Focus, focus, focus. Right? And then you have a manual camera, you have to manually focus. And I recommend making sure you look through the viewfinder. Even on a digital camera where you have a screen, use the viewfinder because you're going to be sure that you're focusing on the right space, right? If you use automatic focus, the chances are your camera might focus on something that you don't want it to focus on, and then you've lost your shot. So your success in using a film camera is using the Sunny 16 rule and doing brackets. Now you can do, like professional photographers, you guys will often do a bracket of 5 photos. And with a digital camera, you can actually set your camera to do that. So you would have your correct exposure in the middle, right, of 1/125th, or I'm sorry, 1/250th of a second, right, because that's what we were using for our Sunny 16 rule. And then you would do 1 at 1/125th, 1 at 1/60th, 1 at 1/500th, and 1 at 1/1000th of a second. So even though this is your correct exposure, you're giving yourself a little insurance on each side there to make sure that you get the shot that you want. And this is really important when you're using film, because obviously you can't look at the photograph before it's taken, right? You can see through the viewfinder, but you don't see what the photo looks like. So even with all this caution in using the Sunny 16 rule, which is really basic daylight exposure, okay, even with all of that caution, you still may not get the shot you want, right? You may want it slightly underexposed or slightly overexposed for the effect that you want. So it's really important that you do bracketing, and you'll be happy that you did, because you'll find that you get a lot better results because you'll get the shot that you want. And that's the exciting thing about photography, right? Film photography is all about the surprise. When you get your photos back and you say, oh my gosh, these are fantastic, or oops, I screwed up, okay? So you don't want to screw up. You want to do it right the first time. So make sure you bracket. I recommend doing a bracket of 3. Like I said, on digital cameras, you can set your camera to do an automatic bracket with every shot. So when you take one shot, it actually takes 3 to 5 shots of the same image and has them at 3 to 5 different exposures. So you can have that automatic bracket on your digital camera. For us here, we're going to follow the Sunny 16 rule. Remember, f16, full sun, and your shutter speed is 1 over the ISO, right? So whatever the closest shutter speed to your ISO is. And you're going to do bracketing. So I recommend you do a bracket of 3. Okay. All right, there's your bracket. So all you number people, you got your bracket of 3 there. All right, so to recap, you're going to use Sunny 16 rule, which is basic daylight exposure, okay? And you're going to bracket. And that ensures that you're going to be successful with your camera. Besides that, just make sure that you spend some time creating a good composition, right? Remember about your composition. Thanks, and we'll see you in class.